Thank you, Choir, and Doug, and Fred. I always live in terror. I wear this thing in my pocket. This is my microphone pack. It's attached to this thingamabob I wear around my ear. I always live in terror that I'll be singing with the choir and forget to turn this off. And special, so you didn't even pay for that. Well, among the many hats that Ellen has worn in her life, and yes, she did know I was going to be talking about her this morning before this. She's been a documentary filmmaker. Any of you know that? Yeah. Yeah. The films that she produced were shown mostly on PBS TV stations all around the country, and they won numerous awards. Very varied type of topics. She documented history, sports, science. She hung out with astronauts. She rode in the Vomit Comet, if you know what that is. She always worked with the same film crew, and they traveled all over together, researching, collecting interviews, going wherever the story happened to take them. One particular film that was very good traced the lives of the Comanches, the indigenous people who dominated vast areas of the Southwest and northern Mexico, who fiercely resisted the encroachment of other tribes and the Spanish and then later Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. Comanches were the very first tribes to master horseback riding, and they were arguably the very best at that. For good reason, they were known as the Lords of the Plains. For hundreds of years, the Comanches lived as nomads. They moved seasonally throughout the Great Plains in the Southwest, and they traveled light, hunting and gathering wherever nature provided food. As Ellen was producing that film, one of her collaborators regularly was a guy named Dale Robinson. And Dale had this wonderful, dry sense of humor. And one day, Dale was reflecting on the daily life of a Comanche compared to our modern concerns. He said, water was a necessity. You had to find it every single day to survive. And if you found food too, well, then that was a really good day. So he said, no one had time at the end of a long day's work to look at their spouse and say, you just aren't meeting my needs anymore as a partner. Well, Dale was stating something I frequently lose sight of, and I think we all can from time to time. Now, we're not in the position, most of us at least, of worrying that much about taking care of our basic survival. Our lives are crowded with conveniences and luxuries, and we can invest those things with a whole lot more significance than they deserve. We can forget that our most basic need is knowing every day where we'll find water. By that, of course, I don't mean water literally. I mean living in such a way that we are grounded with roots fed by something deep and enduring, something that nourishes us and sustains us and lets us flourish no matter what happens. And I'm a great example of not always living that way. One Saturday a few years ago, I was picking up roadside trash by a stretch of highway that my church had pledged to keep clean. We got this big group of volunteers together every spring and every fall for this roadside trash pickup day. And many of the folks there were not even members of our church yet. We would just announce the event on social media and what we were doing. All kinds of people would show up to help. But there we were. We were all wearing very stylish day-glow orange vests to avoid being hit by the cars that were whizzing by. And I stopped to chat with one of our church members. Both of us were dragging these huge, oversized black bags full of trash that we had collected, trash that people had tossed out of their cars. And in that conversation, I found myself saying something to her that often comes out of my mouth in high-minded moments when I'm compelled to dispense pearls of wisdom to unsuspecting victims. I said to her, I think all of life, everything, is spiritual. In other words, spirituality is not something that we do or we make an appointment for, like, pardon me, but I'm going to go be spiritual now. Of course, there are some moments when we concentrate more on spirituality than other times, when we're intentionally connecting to and being alert to the spiritual nature of life, such as right now in church, or when we're sitting quietly meditating, or when we're in prayer. But what I was referring to that day while picking up trash is my sincere belief that the spiritual nature of life is ever present. No matter what is going on, it's all around us, and we should take great delight in that. It's just a matter of being aware of it, really, so that we can be aware of and celebrate the spiritual nature that we find in each other and other people, in a bird song, in a good meal. We can hear the voice of God in a fine piece of music, like we just heard, or in the laughter of a child. We can see sacredness in a ray of sunshine or in a rainbow or a starry sky. Practically any moment, no matter what's happening, we can be alert to and connect with God's presence, God's spirit, and we can live in deep gratitude for that. But for whatever reason, on that day, when those words came out of my mouth, while I was waxing poetic about being alert to the spiritual in everyday things, I had one of those moments of self-awareness, a stabbing sensation of hearing my own hypocrisy, because all too often I don't actually live like what I had just claimed was really true. It was true enough in that particular moment, talking with that person, a member of my church, but I also had been thinking that very same morning, only moments before, while I was picking up trash, about all those dumb and irresponsible knuckleheads who toss trash out of their cars. There were all kinds of normal stuff like soda cans and fast food wrappers and all kinds of weird things I won't even mention. And it made me wonder about whoever was operating a motor vehicle at the time. They tossed it out of their cars. So thinking about all that stuff and cursing under my breath about those careless trash throwing buffoons, I realized I was not truly living as if I believed everything is spiritual. Picking up trash instead of my energy being focused on gratitude for all the good we were doing that day together, I was mostly wasting my energy, being frustrated at all the inconsiderate people in the world whom I would never meet. You know, the things that we think of as legitimate concerns, the stuff that we fret over, get frustrated about, maybe even outraged about, that can vary a lot depending on the circumstances, but reminding myself that I claim to believe that everything is spiritual, immediately after getting worked up about trash on the side of the road, well, it just felt rather inconsistent at best. It's not that we don't ever have genuine things to be concerned about. Life can be stressful. There is a ton of injustice in the world. Depending on your point of view, every day can seem to offer some kind of fresh assault on common sense and decency and the rule of law and human kindness. In more ways than one, it can feel like there is always some kind of trash littering our collective roadside. And we can be filled with rage at those who are doing the littering. But still, what I was recognizing that morning at the side of the highway was just how easy it is to lose sight of what I claim to believe as a person of faith. If everything is spiritual, if I'm supposed to be able to find God's love and peace and wholeness in anything, in any situation, no matter what comes, then why do I not consistently feel that way? Why am I ever thrown off balance by little things, even if it's just for a moment? Less all the big things that seem to dominate the news. How can I reconnect and more consistently live like everything is spiritual? Well, for me, it's an ongoing process. Now, one reality I have to remind myself of every day is that how I am doing, how I am feeling, is really largely up to me. That when someone else makes me mad, for instance, that person really hasn't made me anything. My response to them may be to be mad, but ultimately that's my response. Whether I'm out picking up trash or I'm appalled at what I'm reading in the news, beyond the immediate shock of processing what's happening, I've got to remind myself that I possess a freedom of choice in how I respond to it. But I do have to remind myself of that freedom. Otherwise, it seems, at one extreme, I'll run the risk of living in a state of perpetual shock and outrage and grief. And at the other extreme, if I just look away as a self-defense mechanism and tell myself that I can't possibly make any difference as a mere individual. So what's the use? By doing that, I run the risk of my heart being hardened to the point of not being able to care anymore. one thing I've concluded is that I don't want to live at either end of those extremes. It's just not helpful. It's not constructive to be either perpetually angry and afraid or attempt to be blissfully ignorant. I can't do that. I have to remind myself that I possess the freedom to pursue a truly constructive path. Now, it doesn't always work. To remind myself I have the freedom of how I can respond to anything. I can still vacillate between outrage and then attempting to look the other way. But when it does work, when I feel like I can have a balanced, measured response to anything that happens in life, it's because I have remembered something quite important, something I think is essential. It's because I've remembered that I am a spiritual being. And that I believe life is a spiritual experience as much as it is a physical or a material one. I've even thought about having t-shirts made up that say, I'm having a spiritual experience. Because sometimes I need to look in the mirror and remind myself of that. I think of it as a process of finding my ground and of standing my ground, reminding myself that I am rooted in something deeper and something more enduring than whatever's going on around me at this passing moment. And that something is the simple truth that I am a beloved child of God whose love is flowing through me and is inhabiting and is animating everything. So everything is spiritual. It was about 2,500 years ago that the psalmist began writing down poems and songs that were collected from the sacred oral traditions of the Hebrews. Some were said to have been composed by King David. Many scholars believe that the very first psalm was composed by a gentleman named Ezra. And Ezra was an important scribe and priest, and he helped reestablish Jewish worship practices after the people had been released from captivity in Babylon and allowed to return to Jerusalem. You can read all about Ezra in a book in the New Old Testament called Ezra and Nehemiah. And Psalm 1 is classified as a song of praise, also as a wisdom psalm. And a very common hallmark of any wisdom literature, including the Psalms, is the solid advice to trust in God's ways. In other words, follow God's laws, walk along God's pathway, look for God, listen for God, be alert to God, because God is everywhere, in everyone and in everything. And Psalm 1 includes the image of being grounded, like a tree near a stream, putting down deep roots that are always being fed by the waters of God's love. So if you're like that tree, the lesson is you're being nourished day and night. You're alive in a reality that is stronger than anything that's going on around you. However bad the winds may blow or the storms may rage, you are grounded. The roots may be hidden from plain sight, but that's what's keeping your spirit and your very self flourishing. And knowing that is to be aware that everything is spiritual. In the midst of the small and the large things that crop up and that can conspire to throw us off balance, if we can be alert to that greater reality of our rootedness, if we can feel that grounding, if we can remember what is flowing through our roots, if we can take a breath and pause long enough to see the presence of God in a melody, in the flight of a bird, in a starry sky, in a sunset, even in another person, and even one who may have caused us distress, if we can stop and remember that they're cared for and loved by God just as much as God cares for and loves us, you know what that is? That is incredibly liberating. And for me, when I can take that breath and I can feel those roots that ground me and see the wonder and the beauty and hear the symphony of God's presence, that's when I don't need to be angry or frustrated or threatened by anything or anyone. And I can remember that the long arc of history bends towards justice, and this too shall pass. Well, you know, that's a pretty darn good mantra. And I can remind myself that I'm actually surrounded by very many strong, smart, thoughtful people right here in this very church. Then I can be open to experience the spiritual that is within me and that's all around me, and I can find that it's already present if I just pause for a moment and look and listen. Now, I know that is often a lot easier said than done, you're thinking to yourself, and that's why I will tell you that this is a daily practice. It's a daily practice to seek and to find that grounding, to think, I'm going to be alert for that. I'm going to look for that. Some days life does present us with circumstances we would rather avoid, tough choices we have to navigate, wrongs that need to be righted. That requires work, wounds that can get reopened, annoyances and outrages that can knock us off balance. But if we remember that ultimately we are grounded at a stream of living water this day and every day, we can see life for what it always is. It's a gift. And with God's love flowing through our roots and flowering through our outstretched arms and speaking through our voices and moving through our feet, everything is spiritual. And life is what God intends it to be. Beautiful. Crowned with justice, led by wisdom, fed by God's Spirit, filled with hope.